Joining us right now via Zoom chat is Randy Clark, 32-year veteran of the Border Patrol, and now a journalist with Breitbart and reporting on the border. Good morning to you, Mr. Clark.
Good morning, Joe. How are you today?
Praise be to God. I'm alive, and that counts. How are you?
I am doing just fine.
Oh, we're glad for your time today. Thank you for being on. Thank you for your service, too, by the way.
You're welcome. Thank you.
255% increase over last year at this time at the border. Clearly, we have a major problem at our border. Can you just kind of catch us up? How do you see this, especially in light of the Title 42 back and forth with the Supreme Court?
Well, I think we're really in a quagmire right now. We found ourselves in a situation that the federal government can't handle. I don't think some local cities along the border are capable of handling this. And I think now we're seeing cities inside the United States like New York, Denver, Chicago, that are also having difficulties. And the numbers that they are seeing really pale in comparison to what crosses the border on a daily basis. So I think the problems and the issues are coming to light. But I think those who are empowered to change this and maybe have a better impact on what we're seeing every day are turning a blind eye to this. This is a situation that in 32 years of the Border Patrol, I never saw this. And what irritates me about this situation is most concerning is that those that are involved to the greatest extent and suffer the consequences of the situation on a daily basis are those that really don't have a voice. We just saw a president fail to come to the border because of an economic event in Arizona. Well, what does that say to those people who are most affected? And those people most affected primarily are the migrants themselves that are losing their life on the border in numbers that are record-breaking that we've never seen before, and the Border Patrol agents that are trying to care and provide humanitarian needs for thousands that are coming over, and the people in the cities that really are overwhelmed. The medical facilities are overwhelmed. I witnessed the burials of migrants in Eagle Pass, and I, too, am a Catholic, and they were transported in the back of a pickup truck bed, and they were literally physically tossed in the same body bags they were recovered in with no ceremony, with no priest or no clergy there to even say a word. And so to see that firsthand and to live that firsthand on the border and not have anybody think that this is of consequence or this is something we need to look into is really concerning for me.
Yeah, I think even as Catholics, but just as citizens of our country, there's clearly a major problem. And frankly, I don't know that have we seen a good, in your 32 years of service, have you seen really good border policy coming from the federal government in spite of who might be sitting in the White House or in Congress? I know Donald Trump tried to secure the border, and there was a lot of resistance to that. But in general, overhauling our border policy is more than just building a wall, because to the point you just made, like these people, I feel like we're being codependent with bad guys here. We're encouraging not only illegal behavior, but evil behavior, cartels taking absolute advantage of the situation, making billions of dollars, indenturing and putting in people into slavery, molesting or worse. And then on the other side, we're bringing them in. Is this for a political agenda? Are we doing this to replace our population? Do we even care what happens to these people once they get across the border? I mean, the whole thing seems like a bad deal.
Well, I believe it is. My first year in the Border Patrol, Ronald Reagan was the president. And my last year in the Border Patrol, which was 2020, obviously was the end of the Trump administration. And I think a perfect example of what you're saying is the Title 42 issue. And that I'll get to in just a second. But you're absolutely right. Policy was really never in a spot where it should be, where we could have a discussion on both sides of the political spectrum here in the United States about what needs to be done that benefits everybody. If we're going to let people in the United States, then it should be beneficial to them. And if we're going to keep people out, well, we do so in as humane manner as we can. We did not get there. What we saw was a significant decrease in the last administration because of policies that were put in place, mostly to expel migrants as quickly as possible if they did not have a valid claim of asylum, or in the case of the Remain in Mexico program to actually wait that asylum in the safest third country that they could possibly find from where they left. So the numbers dropped through the floor. When Title 42 was enacted, I was in on the conversations because I ran the Border Patrol stations in the Del Rio sector on how it was going to be implemented and what the purpose was. And I can tell you, we remember the early days of the pandemic. It scared all of us. I went to funerals for several Border Patrol agents that I worked closely with who were under 50 that succumbed to the disease. And so there was a big worry, and it was brought about specifically for the pandemic. And it was applied as broadly as possible to keep Border Patrol agents from having to put people in close quarters and spread that virus. It since has morphed to a selective, well, it's going to apply to Venezuelans, but it will not apply to Cubans, and it will not apply to Nicaraguans, but it will apply to adults, but not children. And so that's where this battle was lost, because it became an immigration tool, and it was never intended. So I think it's a dangerous situation when we fight for the government to keep a rule that really doesn't make sense, because that gives them the power later on to create a rule that doesn't make sense and impose it on just about anybody. So the 42 issue, it really needs to go for good reason. I think the pandemic is nowhere near where it was in 2020 and into 21. We have the vaccines. Many of these migrants in the processing centers right now, they are getting the vaccine and they're getting flu shots in there. And the detention situation is another really sad part of this equation.
You know, that's an issue in a story that goes back many years. Splitting families up, obviously, under the Obama administration was a big problem. But it also became a political tool, because we also saw the reports that said there were adults coming across the border with kids that didn't belong to them. They were being rented, or they were kidnapped kids, or there were several different scenarios there. Talk to me about that.
Well, so there was a time when we were in the midst of the great surge that we had in 2019, and we actually had people from Homeland Security Investigations performing rapid DNA tests to try and combat that problem. And we know that there was a small percentage of children, young children being shuttled. They were brought in so that the older adults could be released as a family unit. And then the child was shipped back to a third country, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and was brought back again. And so people were seeing these children at airports, going back to those countries. So that was a real problem. And it certainly, when you look at the numbers, it's a small percentage. But that's a big problem. Right now, though, in 2019 and 20, we were dealing with tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors. When you say, well, family separations, during the Trump administration, there were family separations for the purpose of prosecuting the adults as a deterrent. And in that particular year, in 2020, there were 30,000 unaccompanied minors, and 5,000 were separated from their families as a deterrent to prosecute the adults.
Hold that thought right there.
Now,
just before we went to the break, we're talking about families being broken up and the complexities of that. It's hard. I got to imagine this is incredibly hard, because ultimately we're wanting a just system with which to keep bad people out and let good people in a legal and regulated way. And it seems like the Border Patrol agents are dealing with incredibly complex situations. What is the heart and mind of the average Border Patrol agent in all of these headlines that we read that feel so overwhelming and so negative? Where does the Border Patrol agent stand?
When we were talking about the children, in the last 2 years, 300,000 unaccompanied children have been arrested and placed into government custody to find sponsors. And right now, today, as you and I speak, there are more than 11,000 unaccompanied children whose families chose to self-separate and send their children across the border alone. They are in federal custody right now. Nearly 11,000 with Health and Human Services, and another 500 and change with CBP that are waiting to get transferred to them. 300 or better each day cross, 300 or better are released to people in the United States in what is really a conveyor belt. So the Border Patrol agents see that. To answer your question, they see that every day. And I lived that during the 2019 crisis. And it's very hard to describe to somebody who is not physically there what it's like to go into work. And granted, we're seeing it for 10, 12 hours a day. Those migrants that are in custody, they're seeing it 24 hours a day until they're either returned to their country or they're released onto the streets. And so when you have a facility that's designed to hold 1,000 people and there are 3,000 people being detained, or in the case of the station that I was operating, I had space for 250 single adults. And what that means is I don't have beds, I don't have a kitchen, I don't have a staff that is capable of preparing food, I don't have a medical staff, and I have 800 or better migrants in custody. Well, guess what? We're overwhelmed. We're cooking with microwaves. We're trying to administer medicines without the staff to remember that perhaps your 4-month-old child is the one that needs the flu medication every 8 hours. And there isn't a staff to do that. They're sleeping on concrete floors, and we get to go home and get in our warm beds at night with our children. And when they're sick, we know that they're getting their medicines. So Border Patrol agents every day have to go into these crowded facilities, and so do the staff members that now, it's a little bit better because they have medical staff. That has changed, but it's not enough. Our congressman here, Congressman Gonzalez, went to El Paso and visited one facility. He saw 500 people in a detention area designed for 100 with one toilet. So, just imagine that with that description.
Yeah.
But these folks that come over, I've had to go to our local grocery store and pharmacy and take off the shelf every over-the-counter lice medication because I could see them itching in those cells and I knew we had an outbreak. We put outdoor sinks just to give them some relief. And so when you see that day in and day out, it has an impact. And in addition to that, it is these Border Patrol agents and local law enforcement authorities and fire and rescue that are recovering these bodies. And I, too, have been involved in that, but not to the extent of some of the boat patrol folks that patrol in the river that have to retrieve those bodies that have drowned. And the ages range from months old to a little bit older in mid-adulthood. And so you go home to your family and you hug your children, and you just pulled a 4-month-old baby that drowned 3 or 4 days ago out of that water. So you can sense my frustration that anybody could say there are more important things going on and I can't go look at this border. Well, these are the people that have the power to change policy, to influence policy, and make a difference. And I think we're in a bad spot, and we can't get to the point where both sides could ever sit down and come up with a viable solution. Like you said, keep the criminal element out, and then ask ourselves, what can we handle? And there's a third element of folks that are seeing this from a different angle. And those are the folks that are in Nicaragua, that are in Panama, that are in other places where they see their young adult and the future of their countries fleeing by the thousands daily. Well, that's the heart and soul of their countries. Those are the workers. So they're having worker shortages. Meanwhile, we are sending billions to those countries to address the cause of migration. Well, when the money gets there, those people will be gone.
Wow. So let me ask you a question then. Let's just say hypothetically that you are asked to provide advice to the administration. This one, next one, doesn't matter. What would you say to a president to suggest on how we could go about fixing all of these problems, doing something in order to create relief at our border for the best interest of our country and for those obviously impacted and affected trying to come across that border? What would you suggest we do?
Well, I think we were headed in that direction in 2020 where policies, because people talk about barriers, build a wall. That's great. But if there's no policy on the other side of that wall, all you're doing is impeding a little bit and you're maybe even causing a danger. But good policy discouraging folks not to leave their homeland, and then looking at the situation then, because right now people are coming in illegally. We are spending more of our dollars and focus on the illegal portion of migration than we are on the legal. And we forget that there are legal mechanisms to migrate to the U.S. Are they sufficient in the eyes of some? Maybe they're not. But you'll never sit down and have that conversation so long as the border is this porous and out of control. The folks that are getting here now are the poorest of the poor. Those that fled Venezuela first were those that migrated on foot into Colombia because they were the ones that were starving. When we first saw the Venezuelans get here, they were mostly wealthy that were flying into Mexico because they didn't need a visa. They were staying for a very short amount of time at shelter because they had family here, Houston and Florida, and they were gone from the border area within hours. Now we're seeing those who have been living in Colombia, and I have talked to them myself at the shelters. They had been living in Colombia for a year or more. And now they've decided, well, now's the right time, and now I'm coming. Well, they are the ones that really lack the support system. They don't have relatives here. And now we're seeing the larger cities say, well, we can't indefinitely support people. We need federal government help. So I think we got to get to a place where we were, that we discourage as much illegal immigration as we can. And during that pause, try and get both spectrums, one that sees the only answer to completely get rid of any laws regarding immigration, and the other that says nobody should come into this country. Perhaps it might be, anti-migratory in their political views, and get those in the middle to pull those edges in and say, okay, what more can we do to be a good member of this globe and say, let's help other people? Because I don't want to leave my hometown. I live in a 30,000 population border community, but here's where my family is. Here's where my mother lives. Here's where my aunts and uncles lived and my cousins lived. I don't want to leave here. They don't want to leave their home country either. They really don't. But they're left with no opportunities and no hope for opportunities in the future. So I think we've got to get to a point that we stop the illegal immigration, or as much of it as we can, and then sit down and say, okay, now how do we help? Is the answer moving poverty from one side of the globe to the other? Or is the answer building a larger coalition to say, hey, let's combat the corruption in politics, which is not foreign to the United States. Let's combat the poverty there, which again is not foreign to the United States. We have 40 million people living below the poverty line here right now. What opportunities are we creating for them? And the answer, it's a dismal view here as well. So it is a quagmire, but I think there's a way out. It's just very hard the way we are polarized right now on almost every major issue that we are dealing with as a society.
Yeah, that is very true. And one thing that I'm thinking of while you're saying this is, it's a hard thing when we talk about, we get down into the dirty of it, talking about the individual lives, because we want to have compassion on people. But at the same time, it's not compassionate to allow the excesses and the problems and all these things and violation of laws, and all these things are very bad. And it makes me think of the words of our Lord when he said that the poor will always be with us. And St. Thomas More telling us that in his book Utopia, how this idea that we can abolish poverty, we can create a nation where everything is working perfectly is not real. We live in a valley of tears, and everything on this earth will not come to that. And so I guess my question for you is, we're not really trying to find a good outcome. We're really trying to find the best or the least worst outcome, I would say. What is your thoughts on that exactly?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And one of the frustrating things is when you don't look at this situation up close, but you have to live it every day. One of the things that disturbed me the most, besides the loss of life, is when you retrieve a body from that river and you can see with your eyes right there is a perfectly good bridge that human could have crossed with their family and not drowned. And we're not affording that in a legal manner if that's what we're going to do. When a president says, I urge all of you to search the border, they listen and they came. But what he didn't tell them is, I'm not going to allow you to use that bridge. You're going to have to ford that river, and that river can go from ankle deep to 12 feet deep in a matter of feet. And when the currents raise, if you're pushed a little bit, that's it. Nobody is quizzing these people. How good of a swimmer are you? Here's a flotation device. They're just saying, hurry. There's 1,000 of us. There's 700. And we all got to get across this river, and it is freezing out here. Yeah. So that's the frustrating thing is, that certainly is far from the best outcome. And I think that's how we got to look at this border is, do we want anybody dying in inhospitable terrain or in that river? And the answer is it should be a resounding no. There's a bridge and there's a mechanism and there are ports of entry to come in. How do we get to the point that if we invite you here, that's the way you come, because that's the way you would go and come. That's the way I would go and come. I'm not bringing my family through that river and risking death, but I'm not in as dire situation as they are. So I think there are better ways to do this. And I think everybody should agree that we are smarter than that as human beings. We are more developed and smarter than that to encourage and allow an absolutely out of control situation to continue to go on.
We're just about out of time. The only other caveat that I would throw into this is I also believe we ought to not only secure our border, revise our policies, have a different, more humane outlook on immigration, but we must sever the cartel's capability to be involved in this process at all. They are evil.
Amen.
And we should treat them like the enemy and destroy them. But nonetheless, we are very grateful to you, Mr. Clark, for your time today. God bless you. God love you. And have a great day, sir. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Same to you all.
All right. Coming up at the top of the next hour, if you can join us, David L. Gray is going to be on. We're going to be talking about the subjugation of language to further the woke cause. All that and more is coming up the next hour. Go to grnonline.com/CDT.